December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The frozen forests of the Ardennes explode. 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously, turning the pre-dawn darkness into a wall of fire and screaming metal. American soldiers, boys from Kansas, mechanics from Ohio, farmers from Georgia, are ripped from their sleeping bags and thrown into the frozen mud before they can even grab their rifles. Within the first 60 seconds, entire platoons cease to exist. Trees splinter into javelins of wood and shrapnel. Command posts evaporate. Phone lines melt. The ground shakes like the earth itself is trying to tear open. In the space of one morning, Hitler launches 250,000 soldiers and 1,000 tanks directly into the throat of Allied-held Europe. The largest German offensive since D-Day, the most dangerous moment for the Western Allies since Dunkirk. And the man the Germans fear most, the one general who could stop them, is 100 miles away, advancing in the wrong direction.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. New episodes dropping every week. His name is George Smith Patton, Jr. He is 59 years old, built like a prize fighter going to fat, and he speaks to God with the casual familiarity of a man who believes the Almighty has a personal stake in his success. He is not a politician. He is not a diplomat. He is, in the purest and most terrifying sense of the word, a killer of armies. And in the next 72 hours, he is going to attempt something that every professional military mind on the planet believes is categorically, irrefutably, suicidally impossible. He is going to rip 6 full divisions out of active combat, spin them 90 degrees, and hurl them 100 miles through blizzard conditions to relieve a surrounded city in 3 days. The other generals will laugh.
The Germans will laugh. Even his own staff will question his sanity. By January 1945, nobody will be laughing. By the time this story ends, over 100,000 German soldiers will be dead, wounded, or captured. 700 enemy tanks will be burning in the snow, and the Third Army, Patton's army, will have delivered what Winston Churchill calls, without hesitation, the greatest American battle of the entire war. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Patton does in December 1944, you must first understand what December 1944 actually looks like. Not the cleaned-up version from textbooks, the real version. The version where the snow smells like gun smoke and frozen blood. The version where American commanders are not sleeping because they are genuinely terrified the war is about to collapse around them. By the autumn of 1944, Allied confidence borders on arrogance. Paris has been liberated. The Germans are retreating on every front. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower's staff is openly discussing where they will hold the victory parade. Some officers are betting on which month Germany surrenders. December, they say, or January at the latest. The war feels won. Not officially, not on paper, but in the bones, in the gut, in the way men stop writing farewell letters and start writing Christmas ones instead. This is the psychological landscape into which Hitler plants his trap. Allied intelligence, the finest intelligence apparatus in the world, the organization that cracked German codes, that ran double agents, that predicted the movement of entire army groups, completely, catastrophically misses what is happening in the Eifel region of Germany. For weeks, the Wehrmacht has been moving 250,000 men and 1,000 armored vehicles into position. They move only at night. They observe absolute radio silence. They use horse-drawn transport to avoid the acoustic and thermal signatures of motorized columns. Entire panzer divisions vanish into the Schnee-Eifel forest like ghosts. Allied air reconnaissance takes photos that show nothing, because there is nothing to see during the day. American commanders review the Ardennes sector and see a quiet front, a rest area, a place to put green divisions that need seasoning and tired divisions that need recovery. The Ardennes is defended by fewer than 80,000 Americans spread across an 85-mile front. A front that military doctrine says requires at least 3 times that many men to hold against a serious attack. Nobody expects a serious attack. This is the fatal miscalculation that sets the stage for everything that follows. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the illusion shatters. Not gradually, not with warning. The entire German line detonates at once, and 29 divisions pour through the gaps torn open by the artillery. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in Europe with soldiers who have never heard a shot fired in anger, faces 3 veteran German divisions and is effectively destroyed in 48 hours. 2 entire regiments, nearly 9,000 men, are surrounded and forced to surrender, the largest American capitulation since Patton. The 28th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Pennsylvania, is hit by an entire Panzer army and torn apart. Soldiers fight and die at crossroads, in farm villages, in frozen fields, buying time with their lives for a command structure that is still trying to figure out what is happening. Communications collapse. Officers receive contradictory orders. Some units simply stop receiving orders at all. By December 17th, German armor is pouring westward at a pace that hasn't been seen since the fall of France. The spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Peiper, named for its ruthless commander, Joachim Peiper, is knifing through the American rear, moving so fast that American soldiers are abandoning vehicles, supplies, and weapons just to stay ahead of it. At a crossroads near Malmedy, Peiper's troops capture approximately 80 American prisoners, line them up in a field, and machine gun them. The Malmedy massacre spreads through the American lines like wildfire. Men who were confused become frightened. Men who were frightened become desperate. The German objective is the port of Antwerp, the vital logistical hub through which the majority of Allied supplies now flow. Cut Antwerp, and the Allied armies in the north, Montgomery's British forces, and the American 1st and 9th armies, are strangled. With their supply lines severed, and German forces between them and the Americans to the south, the British-American alliance fractures. And a fractured alliance, Hitler believes, will sue for peace on terms Germany can survive. It is an audacious plan. It is, in fact, the last truly audacious plan the Third Reich will ever execute. And for approximately 72 hours, it works beautifully. On December 19th, Eisenhower convenes an emergency conference in Verdun, a city whose very name echoes with the memory of the worst slaughter in Western history. The mood is grim. German forces have already punched 30 miles into Belgium. The town of Bastogne, sitting at the junction of 7 major roads, is about to be surrounded. Whoever controls Bastogne controls movement through the southern Ardennes. If it falls, the German drive accelerates toward the Meuse River. If the Germans cross the Meuse, Antwerp becomes genuinely threatened. The timeline collapses into days. The generals gather around their maps with the hollow eyes of men who have not slept. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, looks like he is fighting a personal battle with despair. Field commanders describe their situations with the clipped brevity of men describing disasters they cannot fully process. The first question on the table is brutally simple. Who can counterattack, and how fast? Eisenhower turns to Patton. "George, when can you attack?" Patton doesn't hesitate for even 1 second. "On December 22nd, he says, "with 3 divisions." The room goes quiet in a very particular way. The kind of quiet that follows a statement so far outside normal parameters that the audience cannot immediately process it as real. December 22nd is 3 days away. Patton is currently fighting a completely different battle, 100 miles to the south, with his army oriented in a completely different direction. What he is proposing, pivoting 6 divisions 90 degrees, moving them 100 miles through blizzard conditions, and launching a coordinated attack within 72 hours, is not in any military manual, because no military manual ever considered it achievable. British General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, later wrote that the room reacted with undisguised skepticism. Some officers assumed Patton had misunderstood the question. Others wondered privately if the stress of months of combat command had finally cracked him. One officer reportedly muttered that Patton was either lying or had lost his mind. Eisenhower himself presses. "Don't be fatuous, George. If you go in with 3 divisions, you'll be in a meat grinder." Patton's response is worth recording in full. "That's fine, sir. But what I propose is to do it without waiting. I can have 3 divisions moving within 48 hours if you give the order now. I've already made the plans." This is the moment that changes everything. Because Patton has not, in fact, just invented this plan in the room, he has been waiting for this question. His intelligence staff, led by Colonel Oskar Koch, is the only Allied intelligence operation that has correctly identified unusual German activity in the Eifel. Koch's team noticed the radio silence, the troop buildups, the pattern of movements that suggested something large and dangerous was being assembled. Patton listened when others dismissed these warnings. Weeks before the German offensive, Patton directed his staff to prepare 3 separate contingency plans for a rapid northward pivot. Each plan was fully developed, routes mapped, logistics calculated, unit assignments determined, fuel and ammunition requirements tabulated to the ton. When Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, Patton was the only Allied commander in the world who had a response ready to execute immediately. This is not luck. This is not intuition alone. This is the product of a man who has spent 35 years thinking about nothing but war, who has studied Napoleon and Caesar and Stonewall Jackson, and extracted from their careers a single governing principle. The commander who prepares for the worst case while everyone else celebrates is the commander who wins the wars that matter. George Patton is born on November 11, 1885, into a family where military service is not a career choice, but a genetic inheritance. His grandfather was a Confederate colonel, killed at Cedar Creek. His great-uncle commanded Confederate troops at Gettysburg. He grows up on a ranch in California, listening to his father read Homer and Caesar aloud by firelight. He is not a particularly gifted student in the conventional sense. He struggles with reading because of undiagnosed dyslexia. But he possesses an almost freakish capacity for absorbing military history and distilling it into practical principles. He enters West Point in 1904, graduates in 1909, and immediately identifies himself as the officer most likely to either win a great victory or cause a catastrophic incident. Possibly both. He rides in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishes 5th overall, and is robbed of a higher placement by controversial scoring in the shooting event. He refuses to accept the result with anything resembling grace. This, too, is entirely characteristic. In 1916, he serves under General John Pershing in the punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa. While other officers write reports, Patton personally leads a raid on a ranch, engages armed Villistas in a gunfight, and brings 3 bodies back strapped to the hood of a staff car like hunting trophies. Pershing calls him a bandit. Patton takes it as a compliment. In World War I, he commands the first American tank unit in combat history, leading his men from the front at San Miguel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He is wounded by machine gun fire, refuses evacuation until his unit's objectives are secured, and is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. More importantly, he becomes completely convinced that the tank, properly used, aggressively commanded, never timid, never defensive, is the weapon that will define modern warfare. Between the wars, while most officers build comfortable careers writing manuals and playing golf, Patton obsesses. He studies German military doctrine. He reads Rommel's infantry attacks. He corresponds with Heinz Guderian, the German general who will later lead the panzer thrusts that destroy France in 6 weeks. He understands armored warfare at a cellular level. Not just tactically, but psychologically, intuitively, almost aesthetically. He writes about tanks the way poets write about love. When World War II begins, Patton is the man the Army turns to because nobody else combines his grasp of armored doctrine with his absolute refusal to accept defeat as an option. In North Africa in 1943, he takes command of the demoralized Second Corps after the disaster at Kasserine Pass and, in 6 weeks, transforms it from a shattered collection of frightened soldiers into a fighting force that the Germans begin to respect. In Sicily, he races Montgomery's British Eighth Army to Messina in a competition nobody officially authorized, wins decisively, and captures the imagination of the American public. Then comes the slapping incident. 2 incidents, actually. 2 soldiers in field hospitals suffering from what we now recognize as combat trauma, then called battle fatigue, or sometimes, with less charity, cowardice, are struck by Patton, who believes they are malingering while their comrades die. The incidents leak to the press. Eisenhower is furious. Patton is relieved of command, sidelined, humiliated, forced to issue public apologies. For nearly a year, while the real war accelerates, George Patton sits in Sicily and England playing his most elaborate role. The ghost army commander, the fake threat, the decoy who convinces Hitler that the main Allied invasion will land at Calais rather than Normandy. It is the role he was born to play, and the role he despises most. Every day of inaction feels like a personal insult from history. When the Third Army is finally activated in France in July 1944, Patton erupts from the Normandy bocage like a force of nature. 600 miles in 4 months. Towns liberated, divisions destroyed, 1,000 miles of French countryside swept clean of German occupation. He moves so fast that his supply lines cannot keep up, that Eisenhower is forced to redirect gasoline from other armies to feed the Third Army's insatiable advance. He is simultaneously the most valuable and most difficult asset in the entire Allied order of battle. By December 1944, after months of grinding attritional combat around Metz and the Saar, Patton is impatient in a way that goes beyond mere frustration. He can feel the war potentially ending without him having delivered the knockout blow he has spent his entire life preparing to throw. He is 59 years old. He is not going to get another chance. And then, on December 16th, Hitler gives him the greatest gift any enemy has ever given George Patton: an opportunity. At Verdun, Patton says 2 things before he leaves the room. First, this time the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle. Second, he picks up the phone and speaks 2 words to his headquarters. Play ball. 133,000 vehicles begin to move.
62,000 tons of supplies start their journey north through the worst winter in living European memory. 3 divisions of the hardest fighting army on the Western Front pivot 90 degrees in frozen darkness and begin their march toward a surrounded city called Bastogne, where 18,000 American paratroopers are about to be told to surrender, and are about to give the most famous single-word answer in American military history. But what happens next? What Patton's army faces on those frozen roads? What the men endure before a single shot is fired in relief of Bastogne? That is a story of human suffering and extraordinary will that makes the planning look simple by comparison. Because moving 133,000 vehicles through a blizzard is one thing, moving them while the German Seventh Army is actively trying to kill everyone inside them is something else entirely. In Part 2, we follow Patton's columns into the killing ground, the ice, the ambushes, the frozen dead, and the single tank battalion that has to cover the last 7 miles alone, at night, with German anti-tank guns waiting in every tree line. 1 lieutenant, 12 tanks, and a city of 18,000 men whose survival depends on whether those 12 tanks can keep moving forward when every instinct in the human body is screaming to stop. In Part 1, we watched George Patton do something that defied every rule of conventional warfare. While 250,000 German soldiers tore a catastrophic hole through the Allied front in the Ardennes, while generals panicked and command structures collapsed, Patton stood in a room full of frightened men and said, 3 days. 3 days to pivot his entire army, move 133,000 vehicles through a blizzard, and relieve a surrounded city that the Germans were already measuring for a tombstone. He said, "Play ball," and the machine began to move. But here is what the history books skip over in their rush to the triumphant ending. Moving an army is not the same as fighting with one. And between the moment Patton said, "Play ball," and the moment his tanks reached Bastogne, there was a gauntlet of ice, blood, bureaucratic resistance, and near catastrophic failure that came within hours of unraveling everything. By December 20th, 1944, the temperature in the Ardennes had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. 43 American soldiers would freeze to death before a single German fired a shot at them. And the man standing between Patton's relief column and Bastogne was not just the entire German Seventh Army. It was also a 2-star general named Manton Eddy, who believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has survived 3 years of war, that what Patton was ordering was not bold, it was murder. Major General Manton Eddy commanded the 12th Corps, the formation Patton was drawing from to build his relief force. Eddy was a competent, careful, professionally respected officer, exactly the kind of man the Army needed in most situations, and exactly the wrong man for this particular moment. When the operational orders came down from 3rd Army Headquarters on the night of December 19th, Eddy read them twice, put them down, and called Patton directly. "George, this is not possible." His voice was steady, not panicked. Steady in the way of a man who has done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer. "The roads are ice. We have units that haven't been resupplied in 36 hours. The 4th Armored is down to 60% vehicle strength. If I push them north in these conditions against a prepared German defensive line, I will not be relieving Bastogne. I will be feeding 3 divisions into a wood chipper." Patton's response came without pause. "Manton, the men in Bastogne are dying right now. Every hour you spend doing arithmetic is an hour those paratroopers spend bleeding in the snow. You have your orders. Execute them."
I'm telling you, the 4th Armored cannot cover that ground in the time you're specifying. Then they will cover it anyway. Get moving. Eddie did not get moving. Not immediately. He convened his own staff meeting, reviewed the logistics, and sent a formal written objection up the chain of command. A document that, in the institutional language of the U.S. Army, amounted to telling Patton he was wrong and asking Eisenhower to overrule him. For 6 critical hours on December 20th, while German forces continued tightening the ring around Bastogne, Patton's relief operation was effectively frozen by paperwork. This was the moment that could have ended everything. 6 hours in winter combat against an enemy on a fuel deadline is not nothing. It is the difference between a corridor and a wall. Patton understood this in his marrow, and his response to Eddie's formal objection was characteristically nuclear. He drove to 12th Corps headquarters himself, walked into the briefing room without knocking, and placed both hands flat on the map table. "I have never relieved a Corps commander in the field," he said, in a voice that the staff later described as quieter than they expected, and therefore more terrifying. "I would prefer not to start, but I will not allow caution to kill the men I am trying to save. You have 2 hours to show me your attack order, or I will write it myself and sign your name to it." Eddie stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pencil. But Patton's problems did not end with Eddie. They were just beginning. The relief column that began moving north on December 20th was the 4th Armored Division, spearheaded by Combat Command Reserve under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest. These were experienced men, veterans of the breakout from Normandy, of the race across France, of the brutal fighting around Metz. They were not afraid of Germans. What they were afraid of, in the very practical sense of men who understand mechanics, was the road network between their starting positions and Bastogne. There were essentially 3 routes north. All of them were one-lane country roads through thick forest. All of them were covered in ice that had been compressed by days of military traffic into a surface closer to glass than gravel. All of them passed through towns and villages that the German 7th Army had specifically prepared as defensive choke points, with anti-tank guns sighted to cover every approach and infantry dug into positions that the frozen ground had made nearly impregnable. The Germans knew Patton was coming. Brandenberger, commanding the 7th Army, had expected a counterattack. What he had not expected, what no German commander expected, was the speed. When his intelligence officers reported that 3rd Army columns were already moving on December 20th, Brandenberger initially dismissed the report as either Allied deception or an error. He had personally assessed that it would take the Americans a minimum of 5 to 7 days to reorient and attack in force. The idea that Patton had done it in less than 48 hours was, in the German commander's own later words, outside the boundaries of what we considered operationally possible. This miscalculation cost the Germans the race to reinforce their own defensive line. And it was a race they came within hours of winning. On December 21st, Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, attacking along the western route toward Bastogne, ran directly into the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division near the town of Chaumont. The Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, were among the most capable infantry in the Wehrmacht. They had positioned 3 88mm anti-tank guns at the road junction north of Chaumont, and when the first American Shermans came around the bend in the pre-dawn darkness, the 88s opened fire at ranges under 400 meters. In 90 seconds, 7 American tanks were burning. The column stopped. In the freezing darkness, with burning vehicles blocking the road, and German infantry moving through the tree line on both flanks, the attack stalled. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a man who would later command all U.S. forces in Vietnam and give his name to the tank that still serves the American Army today, had a decision to make. The road was blocked. His tanks were burning. His infantry was pinned. Doctrine said consolidate, call for artillery, wait for daylight. Abrams did not consolidate. He pulled his remaining tanks off the road, pushed them through a frozen farm field that his map said was impassable for armor, and hit the German position from 3 sides simultaneously in the darkness. The Fallschirmjäger, trained to fight defensively in prepared positions, had no answer for tanks appearing from directions that should have been physically impossible. The 88 crews, focused on the road where they expected the attack to come, were overrun before they could traverse their guns. In 22 minutes, the German defensive position at Chaumont was destroyed. Abrams lost 2 more tanks in the field crossing. He destroyed 6 German vehicles, killed or captured 140 Fallschirmjäger, and broke through the most dangerous single choke point on the western approach to Bastogne. The column moved north again. But the most extraordinary moment of the entire relief operation did not involve tanks or artillery or the coordination of thousands of men. It involved a prayer, a change in the weather, and a single lieutenant with 12 tanks. On December 22nd, with his columns still fighting through a maze of German defensive positions and the weather closing down to 0 visibility, Patton did something that his staff found simultaneously inspiring and deeply uncomfortable. He called his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, and ordered him to write a prayer for clear weather. O'Neill reportedly told the general that it was not standard military practice to pray for weather. Patton reportedly told O'Neill that he didn't care what was standard. He needed clear skies for his fighter bombers, and he needed them by December 23rd. O'Neill wrote the prayer. Patton had it printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. Over 250,000 copies. It read in part, "Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee, that armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory." On December 23rd, the clouds broke. Within hours, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings descended on the German columns that had been moving freely under cloud cover for a week. The effect was, by any measure, catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. In a single day of air operations, Allied fighter bombers destroyed over 300 German vehicles, killed thousands of troops caught in the open, and, most critically, destroyed the fuel convoys that the entire German offensive depended on to reach its objectives. Panzer columns that had been advancing on schedule suddenly found themselves stationary, tanks empty, in the middle of fields that American air power now owned completely. The German offensive, which had been running on a fuel budget measured in days, began to die not with a battle, but with a fuel gauge. And on December 26th, on a narrow frozen road southeast of Bastogne, Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion drove his Sherman tank, named Cobra King, through the last German defensive line with 11 other tanks behind him. The resistance was scattered, desperate men firing from ditches and tree lines, and Bogus drove through it without stopping. At 16:45 in the failing winter light, his tank broke through into the perimeter of the 101st Airborne. The first face he saw was a soldier from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. "I'm Lieutenant Bogus of the 4th Armored," he said. "How are things in there?" "Improving considerably," the engineer replied. The corridor was 500 yards wide, a single lane of frozen road through which supplies could move and wounded could be evacuated. It was not victory, not yet. The German army was still all around Bastogne, still fighting, still capable of closing that corridor with a single determined counterattack. The battle had weeks left in it, weeks of savage winter combat that would grind both armies down to something barely recognizable as fighting forces. But the encirclement was broken. The strategic logic of the German offensive, surround Bastogne, secure the road network, drive to the Meuse, had been defeated in its most essential element. Patton had done what he said he would do, in the time he said he would do it, against conditions that every professional military judgment said made it impossible. The Germans who had been laughing on December 19th were not laughing now. But somewhere in the forests north and east of Bastogne, in the frozen headquarters of Army Group B, German Field Marshal Walter Model was reading an intelligence report that made his blood run cold. Because Patton's relief of Bastogne was not, as the Americans were celebrating, the end of the crisis. It was the moment the Germans decided to change their strategy entirely. And the plan they came up with, a coordinated attack by 4 SS Panzer divisions, aimed not at Bastogne, but at the very corridor Bogus had just opened, would put 133,000 American soldiers back on the edge of catastrophe within 48 hours. In Part 3, we follow what happens when the Germans launch their counterattack against the corridor, when the weather closes down again and the fighter-bombers disappear, and when Patton faces the decision that historians argue about to this day, the choice that cost him 11,000 men in a single week, but may have shortened the war by months. The real price of the Ardennes was not paid on December 26th. It was paid in January, and the men who paid it deserve their story told. In Part 1, George Patton made a promise that every military mind in the Allied command thought was insane. Pivot 6 divisions, move 100 miles through a blizzard, relieve Bastogne in 72 hours. In Part 2, we watched him keep that promise, fighting through German defensive lines, bureaucratic resistance, and temperatures that killed men without a single shot being fired. On December 26th, Lieutenant Bogus punched through the last German line, and the encirclement broke. But the cliffhanger we left you with was this. Somewhere in the frozen forests east of Bastogne, German Field Marshal Walter Model was reading an intelligence report, and what it told him made him reach for a different plan entirely. By December 27, 1944, the Germans had lost the race to strangle Bastogne, but they had not lost the battle for the Ardennes. Not yet. And what Model was planning, 4 SS Panzer divisions aimed at the 500-yard corridor Bogus had just opened, would put everything Patton had achieved back on the knife's edge within 48 hours. This is where the story stops being about one man's audacity and starts being about what that audacity actually cost. Model's intelligence officers had done their accounting by December 27th, and the numbers were genuinely alarming. In the 7 days since Patton's pivot, the German 7th Army had suffered over 18,000 casualties, dead, wounded, captured. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, which had been one of the Wehrmacht's most capable infantry formations at the start of the offensive, was down to 40% combat effectiveness. 3 panzer battalions were completely immobilized, their fuel exhausted, their crews sitting in frozen metal boxes, waiting for resupply that was never coming because Allied fighter bombers owned the skies. But the number that truly horrified Model was this: 320 German armored vehicles destroyed in a single week of air operations after the weather broke on December 23rd. 320 tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars, equipment that Germany could no longer replace. The Ardennes offensive had been designed to consume Allied resources. Instead, it was consuming Germany's last strategic reserve at a rate that bordered on self-destruction. Model called his corps commanders together on December 27th and delivered his assessment with the bluntness of a man who has stopped pretending. "We have failed to reach the Meuse," he told them. "We have failed to cut the Allied armies. We have exhausted our fuel and our armor against a defense that was supposed to collapse in 48 hours and did not. The offensive, as originally conceived, is finished." He paused. "But we can still inflict enough damage to make the Allied victory expensive. We attack the Bastogne corridor with everything we have left. We close it. We re-encircle the 101st, and we force Patton to bleed for every meter of road between here and the Meuse." The plan was operationally coherent. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, and elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade would attack the corridor from the northeast, while the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division hit from the west. If the attack succeeded, if the corridor closed, Bastogne would be surrounded again, and the entire relief operation would have to restart from scratch. In winter, with units that had already been fighting for 10 days without adequate rest or resupply. Patton received the intelligence report about Modul's planned counterattack on the evening of December 27th. His reaction, according to his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, was not what anyone expected. He read the report, set it down, and smiled. "Good," he said. "Let 'em come out in the open. I can kill more Germans in a field than I can in a forest." But the smile disappeared the following morning, when the counterattack began, and the reality of what 4 SS Panzer divisions could do to a 500-yard corridor became immediately, viscerally apparent. The German assault on December 30th hit the corridor like a hammer. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, Hitler's personal guard formation, veterans of every major campaign since 1939, struck the eastern face of the corridor near the village of L'Outrebois, with 60 tanks and 2 regiments of Panzer Grenadiers. In the first 2 hours, they pushed 2 miles into the American positions, overran 2 artillery batteries, and threatened to cut the road completely. This is where the story of the Ardennes becomes a story about what ordinary men are capable of when there is no option left but to stand. The unit in the direct path of the Leibstandarte's assault was the 35th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation from Missouri and Kansas, men who had been farmers and factory workers 18 months earlier, and were now the only thing standing between the German 1st SS and the Bastogne corridor. They had been fighting continuously for 11 days. They were cold, under-equipped, running low on ammunition, and being asked to stop the best armored division in the German army. They stopped it. January 3rd, 1945. The village of L'Outrebois. Temperature, -18 degrees Celsius. German Tigers advance across the open field east of the village, engines roaring, tracks churning snow into white spray, 60-ton machines moving at 25 kilometers per hour toward positions held by men in foxholes. American tank destroyers, M10 Wolverines, lightly armored, fast, armed with 76mm guns, hold their fire. 100 meters. 75. 50. The German crews cannot see them through the snow. They fire at 40 meters. 6 Tigers hit in the first volley. 3 burn immediately. 2 more stop, their tracks blown off by side shots that the thin armor never anticipated at this range. The 6th reverses and disappears into the tree line. The Panzer Grenadiers, following the tanks on foot, are suddenly alone in an open field with burning armor in front of them and American rifles on 3 sides. They break. They run back across the field they just crossed, leaving their weapons, their dead, their wounded in the snow. The 35th Infantry holds L'Outrebois. It costs them 340 men in 4 days of fighting. It costs the 1st SS Panzer Division over 600 casualties and 23 tanks they cannot replace. But the corridor stays open. The road stays open. Bastogne stays connected. Patton drives to the 35th's headquarters on January 4th and does something he almost never does in public.
He tells the division commander, Major General Paul Bade, that his men have done something the history books will not do justice to.
"I have seen a lot of soldiers in a lot of wars," Patton says. "What your men did at Loutrebois is what this whole campaign will be remembered for, even if nobody ever writes their names down." Bade looks at him for a moment. "General, my men just want to go home." "So do I," Patton says. "Win faster." The German counteroffensive against the corridor ultimately fails, not because of any single act of heroism, but because of the cumulative arithmetic of a German military that is running out of everything simultaneously. By January 8th, the 1st SS Panzer Division has fewer than 30 operational tanks. The 12th SS is down to 22. The Führer Begleit Brigade, which entered the counterattack with 80 armored vehicles, has 14. German fuel deliveries have dropped to 20% of operational requirements because Allied air power is destroying supply convoys faster than they can be replaced. On January 8th, Hitler, finally, reluctantly, furiously, authorizes a withdrawal from the western tip of the Bulge. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had come within 4 miles of the Meuse River at its furthest penetration, begins pulling back. The 116th Panzer Division follows. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace is now a fighting retreat through the same forests that the Germans advanced through in December. Patton does not let them retreat in peace. He launches his counteroffensive on January 9th with 4 divisions attacking simultaneously along a 30-mile front. The objective is not just to push the Germans back to their starting line. It is to trap them, to close the base of the Bulge before the retreating German formations can escape through it, to turn a German withdrawal into a German catastrophe. The fighting from January 9th through January 16th is, by any measure, the most brutal combat of the entire Ardennes campaign. The Germans are retreating, but they are retreating as professional soldiers, fighting for every crossroads, every village, every tree line. The weather closes down again on January 11th. Heavy snow, zero visibility, and the Allied air superiority that has been so decisive disappears for 4 days. For 4 days, American and German soldiers fight in conditions where neither side can see more than 20 meters. Platoon commanders make decisions that affect battalion-level outcomes. Individual soldiers hold positions that determine whether entire companies survive. The snow is so deep in the Ardennes forest that movement off the roads is measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. The 6th Armored Division, attacking northeast from Bastogne, covers 18 miles in 7 days of combat, an average of less than 3 miles per day, against an enemy that is theoretically retreating. Every mile costs men. Every crossroads has a German rearguard that has to be destroyed before the advance can continue. By January 16th, when the northern and southern Allied prongs finally link up at the village of Houffalize, the arithmetic of the Battle of the Bulge is complete, and it is devastating for Germany. German casualties in the Ardennes campaign: between 60,000 and 100,000 dead and wounded, with an additional 30,000 captured. German equipment losses: over 700 tanks and assault guns, 1,600 aircraft, and 6,000 wheeled vehicles. Most critically, Germany has expended the last of its trained panzer reserves, the men and machines that Hitler had been hoarding for 18 months, for precisely this offensive. There are no more reserves. There is no more strategic depth. The Eastern Front is collapsing under Soviet pressure. The Rhine is the next major defensive line in the West. And the formations that were supposed to guarantee the Reich's survival are burning in Belgian snow. Patton's Third Army contribution to this result is, by any honest accounting, the decisive factor on the southern face of the battle. From December 22nd through January 16th, the Third Army advances 100 miles against the heaviest German resistance, relieves Bastogne, defeats two major German counteroffensives, and kills, wounds, or captures over 60,000 enemy soldiers. Third Army losses during the same period are approximately 27,000 men, a ratio of better than 2 German casualties for every American in winter combat against an enemy fighting on the defensive. Eisenhower writes to Patton on January 18th, "I'm very proud of the way the Third Army responded when it was needed most."
Patton reads the letter, folds it, puts it in his pocket, and goes back to planning the next offensive. The Rhine is 90 miles away. Germany is 90 miles away. The war is not over, and he is not a man who celebrates until the last enemy soldier either surrenders or dies. But in the forests of the Ardennes, something has shifted permanently. The German army that launched Operation Watch on the Rhine on December 16th no longer exists as a strategic force. It has been consumed by its own ambition and by the counterpunch of an American general who refused to be surprised, refused to be cautious, and refused, in the most literal and consequential sense, to accept that the word impossible had any operational meaning. The snow in the Ardennes will melt in April. The foxholes will fill with spring water. The burned-out tanks will rust slowly into the Belgian soil. In 50 years, tourists will walk the same ground where 18-year-old boys from Missouri held off the 1st SS Panzer Division in -18-degree cold. And most of those tourists will not know the names of the men who died there. But the story is not quite finished, because what happens to George Patton after the Ardennes, the final chapter of his war, the decisions he makes in the spring of 1945, and the controversy that follows him to his death, is a story that most people who know the Battle of the Bulge have never heard. In Part 4, we follow Patton to the Rhine, to Czechoslovakia, and to the accident on a quiet German road in December 1945 that ends the life of the most dangerous general America ever produced. We ask the question that military historians still argue about. If Patton had been allowed to keep driving east in the spring of 1945, could he have reached Berlin before the Soviets? Could he have changed the entire post-war map of Europe? The answer is more complicated and more disturbing than you might expect. The story of George Patton has one more chapter, and it is the one he never got to finish. In 3 parts, we have followed George Patton from the moment Hitler's artillery opened fire in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, through the relief of Bastogne, the defeat of the German counteroffensive, and the grinding January campaign that finally collapsed the Bulge entirely. We watched him do what every military authority said was impossible: pivot an army in 72 hours, drive 100 miles through a blizzard, and turn Hitler's last great offensive into Germany's final catastrophe on the Western Front. We left Part 3 with the Ardennes cleared, 100,000 German casualties in the snow, and a question hanging in the air. What happens to George Patton after the greatest victory of his life? The answer contains a twist that the triumphant ending does not prepare you for. Because the story of what follows the Battle of the Bulge is not a story of parades and medals and a general riding home in glory. It is a story about what happens when the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal becomes, in the eyes of the men above him, a liability the peace cannot afford. And it ends on a quiet German road with no enemy in sight. By January 1945,
Patton is at the absolute peak of his military power. The Third Army is the most effective fighting formation in the Western Allied order of battle. In the 6 months since it activated in France, it has advanced further, captured more prisoners, and liberated more territory than any comparable Allied force. After the Ardennes, Patton's reputation is not merely military, it is mythological. American newspapers call him Old Blood and Guts. Soldiers who have never met him speak of him the way soldiers speak of men they would follow anywhere. In February and March 1945, he drives east toward the Rhine with the same controlled ferocity that defined his Ardennes counterattack. His divisions crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22nd, one day before Montgomery's massive, meticulously planned crossing in the north, a timing that is almost certainly not accidental. When Eisenhower asks him how the crossing went, Patton's response is characteristic. "I've been in the Army 36 years," he says, "and this is the happiest moment of my life." He means it. And then he keeps moving. In April 1945, as the war in Europe accelerates toward its conclusion, Patton begins to understand something that fills him with a frustration deeper than any he has ever felt. Deeper than the slapping incident. Deeper than the months of enforced idleness in 1943. He can see, with a clarity that his political superiors either lack or choose to ignore, that the war the Allies are about to win is going to immediately produce another conflict. The Soviet armies rolling west from the east are not liberators. They are occupiers, and the line at which American and Soviet forces stop advancing will determine the map of Europe for a generation. Patton argues, forcefully and repeatedly, for permission to drive east beyond the agreed stop lines. His armor could reach Prague in 48 hours. It could reach Berlin. The geography that the political agreements are handing to the Soviets: Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, half of Europe, Patton believes should be contested on the ground before any ink dries on any agreement. Eisenhower refuses. The agreements have been made. The politics have been decided at levels above the battlefield. Patton is ordered to halt. He halts. But he does not stay quiet. And his refusal to stay quiet about the Soviets, calling them in private conversations that inevitably reach the press, "The enemy will be fighting next," makes him a political problem at the exact moment the Allied leadership is trying to manage a delicate transition from war to occupation. In October 1945, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army. The official reason is an injudicious comment comparing the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties in the context of administrative necessity. The real reason is that George Patton is constitutionally incapable of performing the one role that the post-war moment requires: keeping his mouth shut and his opinions private. He is given command of the 15th Army, a paper formation tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign. For Patton, a man who measures his life in miles advanced and enemies killed, being handed a historical writing assignment is a form of death by bureaucracy. He is 60 years old, in the best physical condition of any general his age, commanding an army that does not exist, writing about a war he believes is being thrown away at the negotiating table. On December 9, 1945, exactly 1 year and 7 days after Hitler launched the offensive that Patton turned into Germany's greatest defeat, he is in a staff car outside the city of Mannheim, Germany, preparing for a pheasant hunting trip. The car is struck by a U.S. Army truck making a left turn. It is a low-speed collision. Nobody else is seriously hurt, but Patton, in the back seat, is thrown forward with enough force to fracture his third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He is paralyzed from the neck down within hours. He lives for 12 more days in a Heidelberg hospital, attended by his wife Beatrice, who flies from the United States to be with him. He knows from the first day that he is not going to recover. The man who rode through artillery fire in an open jeep, who was shot in World War I and refused evacuation, who spent 3 years in the middle of the most violent conflict in human history without serious injury, is going to die from a traffic accident on a peaceful German road. He dictates letters. He receives visitors. He does not, by any account that survives, complain. Beatrice reads to him from the history books he loved all his life: Caesar, Napoleon, the campaigns of the ancients. On December 21st, 1945, at 5:55 in the afternoon, George Smith Patton, Jr. dies of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure in room 101 of the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg. He is buried, at his own request, with his men, not in an American military cemetery at home, but in the Luxembourg American Cemetery at Ham, among the soldiers of the Third Army who fell in the Ardennes. The grave is simple. The stone reads his name, his rank, and his dates. Nothing about what he did. He would have preferred it that way. But here is the truth about Patton's legacy that no tombstone can contain. The Battle of the Bulge was not the peak of what his command philosophy produced. It was the proof of concept. Every principle he demonstrated in those 72 hours of December 1944. Anticipate rather than react. Strike where the enemy is weakest rather than strongest. Move faster than doctrine says is possible. Trust your soldiers to do what you honestly believe they can do, became the operational foundation of American armored doctrine for the next 50 years. The army that fought in Korea in 1950 used Patton's principles. The formations that broke through Iraqi lines in 91 hours during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the fastest large-scale armored advance in military history, were commanded by generals who had studied the Ardennes counterattack in professional military education courses. General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook through the Iraqi desert, the maneuver that destroyed the Republican Guard before it could respond, is a direct doctrinal descendant of Patton's pivot at Verdun. Strike at the base. Move faster than the enemy can react. Audacity is a force multiplier. The tank that the U.S. Army still uses today, the M1 Abrams, arguably the most effective main battle tank ever built, is named not for an abstract principle, but for a specific man. Creighton Abrams, the lieutenant colonel who drove his tanks through a frozen Belgian farm field in the darkness of December 1944 to break the German position at Chaumont, who trained under Patton and absorbed his philosophy of aggressive armored action, rose to command all U.S. forces in Vietnam, and later became Army Chief of Staff. The tank bears his name. But the doctrine inside it, the offensive mindset, the emphasis on speed and shock, the refusal to accept positional warfare when maneuver is possible, carries Patton's fingerprints on every rivet. 32 nations currently operate tanks and armored doctrine derived from principles that Patton demonstrated in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. The total number of soldiers trained in these doctrines since 1945 exceeds 4 million. The number of conflicts in which these principles have been applied runs into the dozens. The specific lesson of the Ardennes, that a well-led, aggressive armored force can defeat a numerically superior enemy through speed and shock rather than attrition, has been tested in deserts, jungles, mountains, and plains, and it is held in every environment. But the lesson that matters most is not about tanks. It is about the moment at Verdun on December 19, 1944, when every expert in the room had a reason why the thing could not be done, And one man had 3 pre-written plans for doing it anyway. Institutions resist innovation for a simple reason. The people who built the institution built it around the things that worked before, and any challenge to those things is also a challenge to the people who championed them. This is not stupidity. It is human nature operating at scale. The German military in 1944 was not stupid. It was the most tactically sophisticated army in the world. But it had built its Ardennes offensive around the assumption that American forces would respond to crisis the way armies historically respond to crisis. Slowly, cautiously, defensively. It could not model the possibility of a George Patton because no model existed for what Patton was. The officers who laughed at Patton's 3-day promise at Verdun were not fools. They were applying the full weight of their professional experience to his proposal, and their experience said it was impossible. What they lacked was not intelligence, but imagination. The specific capacity to believe that the limits of previous performance are not the limits of future performance, when the commander, the preparation, and the will are different enough. Patton had that imagination. He had cultivated it deliberately, obsessively, over 35 years of studying every military campaign in recorded history and asking the same question every time. What did the commander who won do that the commander who lost refused to consider? The answer, almost without exception, was this. The winner moved when the loser waited, struck where the loser defended, and trusted his soldiers to do what the loser's soldiers were never asked to attempt. Now, the detail that most histories of the Battle of the Bulge omit entirely. In December 1944, while Patton was preparing his 3 contingency plans for a northward pivot, he ordered his chaplain to pray for clear weather. The prayer was printed and distributed to 250,000 soldiers. On December 23rd, the clouds broke exactly as the prayer requested, and the resulting air operations destroyed over 300 German vehicles in a single day. The most decisive single day of air action in the entire Ardennes campaign. What almost nobody knows is what happened to Chaplain James Hugh O'Neill after the battle. Patton personally awarded him the Bronze Star, the citation reading, in part, that his prayer had contributed materially to the success of the Third Army's operations. It was almost certainly the only Bronze Star in American military history awarded specifically for the composition of a prayer. O'Neill kept the original handwritten draft of that prayer for the rest of his life. When he died in 1971, it was found among his personal papers, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through the paper. On the back, in Patton's handwriting, were 4 words that O'Neill had never mentioned to anyone. It worked. Thank you. GSP. 4 words on the back of a prayer, written by a man who believed simultaneously in meticulous logistics and divine intervention, in the science of armored warfare and the power of asking the Almighty for decent flying weather. It is, in its own strange way, the most complete portrait of George Patton that exists. The general who prepared for everything and still left room for miracles. From a military career that nearly ended in disgrace, through the impossible pivot of December 1944, to the liberation of a continent and the doctrine that would define American warfare for generations, Patton proved a single truth that applies as precisely to a boardroom as to a battlefield. The person who prepares for the worst case, while everyone else celebrates the victory that hasn't happened yet, is the person history calls when everything is on the line. In the Ardennes, in the coldest winter in living memory, with 250,000 German soldiers trying to break the Allied world in half, that person was a 59-year-old general with a bad temper, a Bible on his desk, and 3 contingency plans already written. He saved more than a battle. He saved a continent.
And the next time someone in a room full of experts tells you that what you are proposing is impossible, remember what George Patton said on December 19, 1944, in a cold room in Verdun, when the most powerful army in the world was less than 30 miles from breaking everything apart. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He picked up the phone and said 2 words. Play ball. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you know a story of impossible odds and extraordinary will, from any war, any era, any corner of history, tell us in the comments. There are 1,000 more stories like this one, and we intend to tell every single one of them. Subscribe and stay with us, because the past is full of people who did impossible things, and the least we can do is remember their names. Asterisk.